This is an oral history interview with Oles Anderson of the R.E. Oles Company, 702 Michigan National Tower, Lansing, Michigan, 48933, phone 482-1538, at the Oldsmobile History Center on May 13, 1991, with Helen Earley of the Oldsmobile History Center. Mr. Anderson is the grandson of Ransom Eli Oles. Monday, May 13th, 1991. Well, Oles, I guess we're in business here.
All right. This is Monday, the 13th of May, and my name is Oles Anderson, sometimes known as R.E. Oles Anderson, 702 Michigan National Tower, Lansing, and birthday?
Birthday, but you got a phone number?
Yeah, 482-1538.
Fine, and your birth date, if you will.
And the birth date is 23 August 16.
Okay. Oles, I meant to ask you last week, does your family have a family tree that we might have a copy of for our history file? Or could you draw, kind of sketch out a family tree, like starting with Pliny Oles, Mr. Oles' father, and then Oles' side of it?
Well, we have some books that Mother collected that go back to the Revolution and trace the family. It's not a family tree as I'm thinking of it, a picture, something like that, but it's spelled out pretty much in 2 or 3 different books that we have.
Okay.
They were published in Washington, private publication, but not for us, for somebody else. I don't know where Mother got them, but they're quite complete, and she has put her own notations in there to bring it up current.
I see. Now then that would include birth dates or death dates and names of children
Yeah.
she and Ransom Oles had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see. Okay. Well, if we could borrow something that we could sort of make a concise little family tree for your personal file here, that would be a good reference.
Oh, sure, I can bring that out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somebody was telling us, Oles, that your mother had written a history, an Oles family history, or had worked with someone on an Oles family history.
I wouldn't be surprised, and I think that's the outcome of this, these 2 or 3 books I just mentioned. She did keep a journal of her own activities, and I would have to ask my wife where that is. And then, too, of course, my sister would have a lot of information on the family. And much of it that I don't have. This is not my main interest, history, although ancient history is. But the family history, to me, it's just pretty much as I hear it. I'm no authority on it, in other words.
Okay. Now your sister, that would be
Peggy.
Peggy.
In California.
Okay.
And she, if you want to write her wife, or I can call her and tell her what you might like, see what she can do.
Well, would that, which way would it be, you think might work the best, would be better to do it?
Why don't I phone her and then tell her that you're going to follow it up with a letter? Then you'd have something to go on to.
Okay, very fine. That way we'd have her address and phone number too. And yes, we'd like to do that, and maybe that way we could fill in some more missing pieces to the historical setup that we're trying to work on. Okay. that period then would cover, starting with Pliny Olds or with Ransom Olds, the Peggy families?
No, it would start with, he pronounced it Pliny.
Oh, Pliny.
Pliny, yeah.
Thank you for that.
And I think it would start with Pliny.
Okay,
And then work up to present time.
good. What did you call your grandfather? Grandpa? Or?
Well, I called him Grandpa or Gramp,
Okay.
but in visiting with other people, that is outside the immediate family, the most natural thing for me to do is just say Mr. Olds. So during this interview, when I say Mr. Olds, why, it's my grandfather, but that's just the way I always addressed him.
Okay.
Out in public, shall we say, or in talking about him in general conversation.
Okay. When you were growing up, Olds, and you were going to school, I know your family associated with a lot of people in Lansing, or a number of people who were in responsible positions, banks, doctors, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you sense that your grandfather was any different, had perhaps a little higher prestige, is more noted, for instance?
No, I was never aware of anything like that. I really was never aware that he was such a national figure until I went away to school, or and then it wasn't very apparent, or until I'd say in the recent decade or 2 decades. And it always amuses me now, and I say it seriously, and it's interesting, when I would pull into a gas station, and this happened about 15 years ago, and the young cashier said, well, here's a living legend, when they looked at my gas card. Well, I'm never aware of that. And so I get kind of a chuckle out of it. I don't know where they get it, but people do.
Don't you think there's more interest being paid now in automotive history, the automotive greats who
Yes.
made the industry what it is?
Yeah, there really is. I get calls frequently that, did Mr. Olds do this or do that, or we have a picture of a yacht that's supposed to have been his, and can you identify various things? Yeah, I think so.
You're mentioning questions that come to you. Is it all right once in a while we get a question too that we feel you could better answer than we?
Oh, sure.
That's okay.
Yeah. I've often, and I take this seriously, I believe the older we get, the more of a reference figure we become.
Certainly.
Because we have lived it, have lived through it. And so it just seems one of those natural things that come with age.
What does the Olds Company do, Olds?
Well, when Mr. Olds had it, it was a large investment company, stocks, bonds, land, very active holding company, I guess we'd call it today. Today, it is, as I use it, it's pretty much of just an umbrella for family affairs and references. For example, when you fill out an application or you go to a hospital or something, are you employed? Yes. By whom? Our Olds Company. And that seems to be sufficient. So I just use it again as a reference name.
Okay. What about the Ransom Fidelity? What is their responsibility?
Well, that's the oldest one in Lansing. I think it was chartered in 1913 or 14. And until we broke it up a few years ago, it was the largest in this part of the state. And Woody Rowe was the president and the chief CEO for years and years and years. And then when we broke it up, why, everybody went their own way. And so I'm responsible for what's left. But that's strictly a charity. It's strictly a foundation for charitable, educational, and good works, things like that.
I see. Now you say that was the oldest one in the state?
Well, it was the oldest one, at least in this area of the state.
I see.
And it was set up strictly for charitable purposes, and it still is.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, it's a private foundation, and we don't, for example, make any kind of contributions, loans or otherwise, to individuals. We just plain don't. And if an individual has a project, and the project is sponsored by a qualified organization, we'll take a good long look at it, and maybe we will, maybe we won't fund it. But it's strictly a foundation in every sense of the word that we use it today.
And then you say, now when was it broken up?
Well, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago. Woody and I had talked about it for several years, and Peggy, living in California, thought it'd be best if she could take a share, her share, and move it out to California, and the Rowe family took their share and moved it down to the Greater Lansing Foundation. And so I have what's left of the original company.
I see.
And we operate it the same way, but it's considerably smaller.
Mm-hmm. Now, you consider nonprofit groups.
Oh yeah, 501c3.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really about all. If it's anything but a 501c3, we check it out pretty thoroughly if we think that it's worth funding. And we get a lot of different requests every day.
Sure you do. Wow. Could you give us a ballpark figure of how many requests for assistance you get?
Well, I would say at the end of a given week, we would have 15 anyway.
That many.
And I answer every single one of them so that at least they aren't holding their breath. But yeah, and especially now with the cutback on the state funding and federal funding and stuff like that.
Yes. I was saying groups need even more support
Mm-hmm.
because they're losing it in another area. Well, I know you've been very instrumental in helping the Ariels Transportation Museum.
Mm-hmm.
They're very grateful.
Yeah, we don't. There's a good example right there. We don't particularly help operations, but we do help with capital improvement, capital maintenance work, and lately we've been helping out on the membership drive by matching at the end of their drive dollar for dollar that they bring in, up to a certain point, so that they, in effect, they get twice the number of memberships.
Oh, what a nice idea.
So that, and it helps us and it helps them apparently, because they can very easily say, well, look, this is being matched. If you want to join, whatever it is, how much it is, then this will be matched. So it's the equivalent of double the dues. Seems to work out. It did work out last year, and we're doing the same thing this year.
Oh, great. Are you a life member of the museum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we helped them get started, and we put a roof on, I guess, some of the new, I shouldn't say the newer parts of the building. It's new to the museum, but it's an old structure. You know, where Bates Motors were right next door. So we helped them get the roof on that and different things, so that we kind of stand in the background, but the local people do most of the work, and it's certainly gratifying to see what they do, because they pitch right in.
I think we're on the right track down there now.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Is it possible to interview Woody Rowe?
I'm sure it would be when he gets back. He isn't back from Florida yet.
I see.
So, but I'm sure it would be.
Okay.
He knows a great deal about the foundation, about the Fidelity, and the Arioles Company. He was there right after World War II and worked with Dick Lyman and Louis Hull and a lot of those people while I was still out flying around the countryside in behalf of the government. Then I went into the hotel, Hotel Olds, and only when Mother decided that she would like a little relief with her part of the Arioles Company, that's when I became interested in the family business as such. Prior to that time, I was always out in the field someplace.
Well, Oles, why don't you fill us in on your education from the grade school on up, and then your stepping into your the Oles family responsibility. And you mentioned you were out in the field, you mentioned you were flying, and then the Hotel Oles. And
well, I went to the public schools here. I went to the old Kalamazoo Street School, which is long gone, but it was a red brick building, and I think I went there the first 3 years. And then when they tore that down to build the present structure, I went to the Cherry Street School, and then back to Kalamazoo in the new building, and 1 year at West Junior. And then in '29, they figured out that maybe I wasn't getting the education I should have, but only because I was successfully resisting it. It wasn't from lack of effort on the teacher's part. And so I went away to school, Cranbrook School, for 6 years, and graduated in '35. And went to Dartmouth for 1 year, and then transferred to Michigan State for 1 year. By that time, we were almost at war. So I applied for and got a job with the Civil Aeronautics Administration as a link trainer instructor, and was assigned to Houston, Texas, at the standardization school down there. And I was there approximately I'd say 8 years. But I helped to move up to Oklahoma City, where the school now is. And that's when I came back with the idea of going back on the family farm. But it didn't work out that way. They needed some help at the hotel, so I started in the storeroom down there. And then...
the late 40s?
Yes, the late 40s. Mm-hmm. And then helped him sell the hotel to the Jack Tar chain. When was that? 70? 60, 70, somewhere in there. But by that time, I had worked into the office enough, so I was down there helping my mother almost every day, and that's when I became familiar with what Woody had been doing, because it was a joint operation. And
then your mother then was doing, what was her responsibility?
well, her responsibility was her share of the Fidelity. The way we operated that, we estimated the annual income, and then Woody took half of it, and Mother took half of it, and gave it to the people they thought needed it, to the organizations they thought needed it. Hillsdale College, from my mother's standpoint, Kalamazoo College, from Woody's standpoint. We didn't try to make equal gifts but we estimated the 50-50 deal on an annual income. So there were many times when Woody would give to things that we would have no idea what he was giving to, and because after all it was a 501c3, and by the same token we would do the same thing. So it was all a legitimate ethical operation. It's just that we had two branches of the same tree.
Well, now, Woody's mother, Bernice, she wasn't involved like your mother was.
No, Bun was a different type of a person, and was not particularly interested in investments, for one thing, business operations for another, and so she seldom came to the office, and Woody took care of the family's business from that standpoint.
Well, what about her husband?
Well, he was, of course, he had a responsible job. First, as I remember it, I think first at Rio, and then the Ideal Power lawnmower. But then when the Depression came along, or a few years after the Depression, the lawnmower business never really recovered as they were set up to manufacture lawnmowers. And that's when the rotary type of lawnmower came out instead of a reel. They eventually got into the rotary, but it was a little bit too late at that point. And mass production came from, the competition was real heavy from every place. And Ideal Power just weren't set up for it.
Where were they located?
They were over on East Kalamazoo, right by the railroad tracks where Capital City Lumber is now. That great big building used to make lawnmowers.
On the north side or the south?
No, the south side, yeah. Across the street from what used to be the Michigan Butter and Egg, which is now that refrigerator plant.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, they were still in business when I was at West Junior, because in those days we had a very, very fine course or requirement of manual training. And I guess the educational people nowadays think that that's degrading because they don't teach it as they used to. But we had to learn how to make cement. We had to learn how to handle tools. It was strictly a manual training thing. And it was a wonderful course, required. I'm sorry that it isn't today. But every now and then we would get behind, and we'd have to go down to Ideal Power and get our lumber sawed up so that we could go back to class and then continue the work on a box or whatever it was manually. And it really paid dividends.
Well, then, after this Ideal Power Company didn't make it, what did Woody do? He went
that was Blondie who was down there.
Blondie.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was on a bank board. He did various community projects. That's about all I can tell you.
We won't get into him because we're going to cover him another time.
Yeah, Woody can tell you about that.
Sure. Then Bernice was more retiring and a home person more than like your mother, Gladys. Now, her job at the Hotel Olie.
No, she was never in the hotel. My father was. But she was very active civically, and a lot of committees, very active in YWCA work, and helped found the Junior League here. At that time it was called something else, forgotten, Junior something. But Yeah, she was out on various committees at Hillsdale College, Michigan State, close friends of John Hanna and Jack Breslin, very active in a community way, but also interested in the office and the Arioles Company and in her own affairs, and did much of her own investing and handling of stocks, bonds, and so forth.
So she worked together in that project?
Well, I went in to help her out, yeah, because every now and then she'd get behind, and then it was just a normal transition that as she got older and became involved in more outside things, then I stayed in the office.
And was your office always in the tower?
Michigan National Tower, Olds Tower.
Olds Tower.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to have the 10th floor, all of the 10th floor, but then conditions went along and it contracted down to, perhaps a third of the 10th floor. In the meantime, Mother and Bun sold the tower to Howard Stoddard, to the Michigan National Bank, and then they moved us down to 7, where we are now, which is very adequate for what we need. It's a great place.
So you say your mother and Bernice sold the tower to Stoddard?
Well, yeah, when my grandfather died, I don't know whether they inherited it or had owned it or something, but in any event, they ended up as the owners.
I see.
And it became one of those things that it was a major operation to maintain a building like that. And they felt that Michigan National could do a better job, and they had a meeting of the minds and sold it.
When did your mother cease coming down to the office?
Well, that's hard to say, because she would, of course, she would not come in when she was out of town, but lots of times she'd be too busy to come in, so it was just tapering off.
Okay.
That's about the best I can say. And as she tapered off, I went in more and more. Then, of course, when the hotel was sold, I had plenty of time. And then I would start coming in almost every day.
Now, at the end, you started in the hotel as a stock boy, you were telling us. And then you worked up to, what were you doing at the last before you left?
Well, I was the general manager at the end.
Okay.
And of course, you can't be in a business like that without having friends all over the country. And it was through some of those friends that I met the Jack Tar people, and they had previously been interested in buying the hotel, but for one reason or another, it didn't work out at that time. So when I went to a convention in Chicago, that friendship was renewed with Jack Tar people, and the outcome was they bought the hotel. Part of the Jack Tar chain.
Well, now, who owned the hotel then? Did the family?
No, it was a stockholding company. It was publicly held stock. And there were two companies, the operating company, which leased the hotel from the Hotel Olds, now I can't think of the name of the holding company. But the holding company didn't have a great deal to show for itself unless the operating company made money. But my father was so good that when we sold the hotel, not one investor lost a dime. They all went home with money in their pockets. They all went home with the interest that had accrued on their bonds or whatever it happened to be. And that was the end of it.
Now, what was your father's position there at the hotel?
Well, he was the president and general manager, and he took over in '32. And It must have been around 62 or so. I don't recall those dates exactly. It's when he retired. And then the board made me the manager. And of course I was familiar with the operation and everything. But when Jack Tarr came along, wanted to buy it for enough money that everybody got paid off, why, of course, we sold it.
Okay.
Nobody lost a dime, but that's all credit to my dad.
Bruce Anderson was a good manager.
Oh, yes, he was. He was a former banker. When he came to town in 1914, I think it was, I think he started with Blondie at the Ideal Power Lawnmower, but then he went up to the Capital National Bank, and then in 32, Mr. Olds said, you're pretty good with money, why don't you get into this hotel business? And he said, I don't know anything about the hotel business. And characteristically, Mr. Olds said, well, you can learn. And he did, and it was a very profitable relationship for everybody.
Now, you mentioned Blondie. Who is Blondie?
Well, that's Clarence Rowe, Woody's father.
Oh, yes. He was at the Ideal Power.
Yeah, he was an MIT graduate as well as Michigan State, and they were, the young men at that time, they were just out of college, just trying to get started. So
Power lawnmowers were pretty good.
yeah, those, because they were new at that time, and Ideal Power was a really thriving concern. Well, it was a great place for young college graduates to get started, so they both started. I wasn't there, of course.
No.
That's what I understand.
What is your education then? In the colleges you went to, did you have certain subjects you enjoyed, you were zeroing in on?
Well, yes and no. At Dartmouth, it was a gentleman's education. At Cranbrook, it was just a very, very fine education. It was a strict school, but it was a very good school. And believe me, you either learned or moved on at Cranbrook. And I think I had some of the finest teachers that have been there, especially Dr. Stevens, who was the headmaster at that time. And it was patterned after the English private school, only the English called what we call private school, they call them public school. I don't know why. But in any event, that was the pattern in those days. Nowadays, I guess it's quite a bit different. But then at Dartmouth, it was a gentleman's education, although I had a...
What is that?
Well, the classics. And I was in an experimental English class, experimental in the sense that it was patterned again after Cambridge, Oxford, where you don't have a regular curriculum set up. You're given an assignment and it's up to you to finish it up. And it's ironic because at Dartmouth, I just barely squeaked through physics. And yet when I got into aviation, that was the very thing that I was teaching. So you never know what you're going to run into down the road. But that's what I call a gentleman's education, as opposed to transferring to Michigan State when I wanted to get into agriculture, which is and was then a scientific, directed course of study. And so because we had a farm, I was interested in it, and I got along very well with the courses.
Where is this farm located?
It's southwest of town of Lansing, out at Millet, Section 35 of Delta Township, Eaton County.
Okay. Is that
And
near Wacusta?
No, right on the river, on the Grand River.
Okay.
You may remember where the Grand Manor was? That
Vaguely.
very fancy restaurant that Dr. Badgley put together?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was the home that my mother and father built. And we had 300 acres out there. It had a 600-tree sugar bush for maple syrup, lots of grazing land, and enough tillable land. I don't think we ever made money, but we came close to it.
Oh, when you say grazing land, did you raise cattle?
Cattle. Mm-hmm.
What kind of cattle?
Well, sometimes if the market looked good, we would get into white-faced steers. But most of the time, for steady income, we had Guernsey milk cows, golden Guernsey, and we sold milk to Heatherwood Farms. We sold milk originally to the Lansing Dairy Company when we had Holstein. And
how many cows, milk cows, would you have?
we could accommodate, and usually did 20 to 24.
And then you had people working for you to milk them and take care of them?
Oh no, there was another man, Henry Schlegel, and I did the whole thing. And then from time to time we had a third man, and it was just the three of us for the most part. So that it kept us busy.
Did you have any other animals?
We had, originally at that time, we had 2 teams because we did not have a tractor. Finally we got a Fordson tractor at an auction, and at that point, now this was before the war. This was about 1938. We got a Fordson tractor and discovered that maybe that was going to help us more than we thought. Because prior to that time, Henry was an excellent teamster, and we got along fine with 2 teams. And I learned how to drive them, too. But we found out machinery was the way to go, and we went that way.
What did you raise out there? Was it all under cultivation, this 300 acres?
Yeah, except for the sugar bush and the permanent pasture, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What did you raise? What crops?
Well, we had wheat, barley, buckwheat, alfalfa, had a lot of alfalfa because there was a good market at that time. Mm-hmm. And corn, of course.
Mm-hmm. Did you have riding horses?
Well, Dad had a riding horse when we were still in school, when Peggy and I were still in school. And he got Peggy a horse. We saw a picture of it, you know, on the videos.
Yes.
But by and large, well, you know, in 1937, when I was first married, Barbara and I had a riding horse. In fact, we had at least 2, maybe 3, but 2. And I remember that one was a jumper. We bought him over near Battle Creek. And so we had a couple of good years of riding. In those days, the country roads, Kreitz Road and Canal and all those, they were gravel. So we could ride out there, you know, almost without any problems with automobiles. Oh, it was a great area.
I should say so.
Yeah.
Well, how long did you keep this 300 acres? Did that farm always stay that same way, or was it later subdivided?
Well, no. During the war, conditions I was in Texas, so this is hearsay.
Yeah, did you sign up with the service?
Well, I was flying professionally then for the Civil Aeronautics Administration.
Okay.
And Mother was kind of holding down the fort at home. But conditions got to the point where nobody could afford to have a lot of luxuries that went on that we didn't even think as luxuries before the war. So gradually they sold off and curtailed the operations on the farm, and Henry then left and went to Michigan State, where he farmed for, I believe, either that or he was a good diesel mechanic, and I think he went into one of the shops here. But anyway, the farm gradually shut down. Not entirely, because when the war was over and when I came back, Don White was living in the farmhouse, and he was doing the farming with what little we had. The first spring, I remember, I thought, well, now we'll get out and at least have an income through maple syrup. Well, come to find out, all the sugar bush equipment had been sold off, so that was gone. And the evaporator tanks and everything else. So it was almost like starting from scratch, and that's one thing that kind of convinced me maybe I better get into some other line of work. So that's when I went into the hotel. But
where did you learn flying?
Oh, out here, Harvey Hughes was my first instructor, and Carl Parker soloed me. I flew with Bob Odell and Roger Don Ray, and of course Dick Marsh. He and I became very close friends. Well, there were a lot of the old-timers. I'm trying to think of the young man now that lost his life in Alaska.
You mean Wiley Post?
No, he was a Lansing man.
Oh.
But in any event, we did a lot of flying. That's where I learned to fly. And then when I went to Texas, it was as a link trainer instructor. So I learned more about flying down there. And my boss down there was Bill Jones, and he's retired. And whenever I get to Oklahoma City, I always see him. We go out to dinner and talk about the fellows that we knew and who are still around. We're getting to be old-timers in that field.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, when was it that your folks built the home out there on by the river, the Grand Man?
Well, they started in 29, and we moved in 32.
How large a home was that? Remember?
It was a couple of sizes smaller than Meadowbrook down in Detroit. It was a Tudor-type home, a rambling stone structure. I don't remember the square footage or you know, things of that.
8, 9 bedrooms, something.
Oh, yeah.
Large.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they could entertain 100 people and never know it. So it was big.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any of the parties and functions that you attended out there with your folks?
Well, yeah. They, for instance, when Blondie Rowe had his 50th birthday, they had a junior-sized track meet. And this was on the 14th of July, Bastille Day. We always made a big point of that. And the track meet consisted of the javelin throw with toothpicks and the high jump. We jumped over matches that were put up on twigs. Different things like that. And it was a real fun affair.
Yeah, what year was that?
Oh, gee.
Maybe 70s?
No, it would have to be in the late 30s, I think.
Late
yeah.
30s. Okay.
Yeah, it was before the war, I know that. I kind of predicate everything before the war and after the war, because the war just turned the world upside down. And a person today would have a real cultural shock if he were transported back to 1935.
Oh, yes.
And it was just plain different, that's all. But it was a great place out there. The Christmas parties were big affairs. And
those would be Lansing friends that would be invited? Or?
yeah, Mother and Dad would have, well, I don't know whether they catered in those days or not, but they always had quite a hospitality at Christmas time.
Would that be a full meal, a sit-down dinner? Or?
Sometimes, but not for 100. That, the 100 would be a cocktail party, something like that, with hors d'oeuvres, and that's all. But, oh yeah, they really had big times. We were right on the river. They had a couple of boats that you could go rowing or canoeing or whatever you wanted, you know, like that.
Well, then you and your family, Bruce and Gladys and Peggy and you, would go often on trips with Mr. and Mrs. Oles?
Well, in the early days we did, because our family was organized and scheduled by Mr. Oles. And while he had a very nice way of doing it, you did it. So when it was time to go, like we saw the movies of the North Cape trip, well, there was a little resistance when that was sprung, but you'll notice we were all there. And he always did interesting things. Don't misunderstand me, because it was always for the good of the group, and everybody had a thoroughly good time. But sometimes it wasn't, initially, it wasn't always a voluntary situation. But it didn't take long. We had an expression when I was flying, when I was giving instruction I was tell my students that you can do this maneuver any way you want to, but as long as you're here, you're going to do it our way. And you know, they got the message, and we did too. So, yeah, we followed pretty much the way he wanted to go. When we wanted to go to Florida, we all went to Florida. And when he wanted to go, in this case, to North Cape, we all did that. However, he was very, very generous. He had a yacht that would accommodate quite a few people, and we always went interesting places. I was on board one summer for a while. He would rotate people, guests, on board, and his chauffeur would sometimes drive them, let's say to the Thousand Islands up in northern New York State. And they would drive up there and then pick up the ones that were on the yacht, bring them back to Lansing, while the others went on someplace. It was a rotating thing, so there was always a group of people milling around. And they were always congenial. They, to the best of my knowledge, had very little friction. Whether he did it intentionally or whether it just came naturally, it worked out beautifully.
Did you ever see him angry, really angry about something?
Oh yes, oh yeah.
What would anger him?
Well, one Sunday, I think I might have been around 10 years old. It was time to go to church, and my grandmother said, "Oles, have you got got a clean handkerchief?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Let's see it." And I didn't. And that kind of teed Mr. Oles off. And we walked all the way upstairs and all the way back downstairs. And he had a hold of my ear, and I don't think my feet touched the ground very often on the way. And he was really angry. By and large, he had a very even disposition, or a very even temper. but there were times when he could really flash it. And that was one of them that I remember. But he also had a tremendous sense of humor, and I think that predominated most of his life.
Do you remember any comical incidents?
Well, yeah. We went to church one Sunday, and we were a little bit late, but they very thoughtfully were waiting for us. And so we came down the aisle, and my grandmother went into the pew, and this was the First Baptist Church, went into the pew, and then I slid in, and my grandfather put his derby hat on the chair, not the chair, but the pew there, and then proceeded to take his coat off in the aisle because it was a little bit bigger. Well, he then turned around, sat right on his derby. Well, it made a terrible noise. So he started to laugh, and he snaked the derby out from underneath him, and then to make matters worse, he pushed it back into shape right in front of him, and of course the snapping of that derby back into shape made even more noise. My grandmother was highly embarrassed. I could hardly sit still, and he thought it was really something. But yeah, he really had a great sense of humor. But he was a strict disciplinarian. He was very fair, very honest about things, and he had his own way of doing many things, and you just kind of went along with him. After all, he held all the cards. So, but there was never any show of power or anything like that. Nothing like that at all.
Was it really true that he didn't like horses?
No, I think that he probably liked horses as much as anybody did, but he didn't go riding. I probably would have followed in those footsteps had my father not come from Colorado. But he thought there were better ways of doing things, and he was just naturally, mechanically inclined to experiment with them.
When did you first begin to feel that your grandfather was really somebody?
Oh, I don't think I ever got to that point. I gradually began to realize, I think this is what you mean, that he was a little different than the average grandfather. But, you know, when you grow up with someone like that who really is not ostentatious or anything of that sort, you're just not aware of it. And that's one reason why he moved back to Lansing. And I heard him say this from Detroit when they were first getting started. Not only did he get financial backing in Lansing, but he didn't like Detroit to begin with because it was a high society town, even at the turn of the century. And that was not his style. So I don't think he had a great deal of difficulty moving back to Lansing.
Did he ever say why he moved to Detroit in the first place?
Well, yeah, because the money was there. Mm-hmm. But then when they got burned out, you know, Oldsmobile Works got burned out. 1901, yeah. Mm-hmm. Why, it was a golden opportunity to come back to Lansing.
So actually, perhaps in the back of his mind, he really always wanted an opportunity to...
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. I never heard him regret coming back to Lansing. I never heard him poke a finger at those people in Detroit. He had his own lifestyle, and he was comfortable with it. And from other people in the family, I did hear a certain amount of regret that they were not on the social whirl and things like that, but it didn't bother him. And he was comfortable.
And what about Mrs. Oles, Meta Oles? Did she feel the same way?
Well, now that's a good question, and I certainly can't answer it. I never heard her talking about it. She was always right there at his side whenever he needed her. And so I just assumed that she was prepared to follow, because she certainly did. But beyond that, I don't know.
Do you remember any incidents involving her, Oles, when you were growing up or as you got older, specifically?
No, except that she was even more generous than he was, and that when they were first married, she was, well, I don't like to say on an allowance, but she was given a certain amount of money to manage the house, because of course in those days, you know, that's the only way the women could manage the house. And but she was in the habit of giving it away to those who needed it more, at the church, at the sewing circle, things like that. And so when Grandpa stumbled onto that, he said, well, let's do it a little differently. And so at that point, I guess, any giveaway money came from the office. By that time, he had the Arioles Company going, and they handled their finances in a different manner. And I really, to this day, have no idea how they did it. That we didn't talk about money. There was never a crisis. There was a crisis as far as I'm concerned, because I was of a different generation. But we didn't, in our family, we did not really discuss financial affairs or anything like that, at least in front of me. I had my own problems. I had my own allowance. I was accountable for it. At Cranbrook, we had, which I thought was an excellent way of doing things, we had a checking account within the school itself. And for instance, when we went down in the fall, why, we had a checking account that was $50. And if we wanted something from the school store, we wrote out a check. So we knew exactly how much we had in our account at any time. The checkbook, until we learned how to do it, had to be balanced and approved by the master on the floor, the counselor on the floor, so that we were just taught accountability. And it was time to get school books, write out a check, you bought them. And if you ran out of money, then you had to explain to your folks how come you ran out of money. So it was a different world. That's what I'm saying. Accountability was a very high priority without coming out and saying so.
But you never felt put upon that you had to account for your expenditures. That was just a good learning.
Well, at Cranbrook, that was a good learning experience. However, as we went along, I myself did not have unlimited spending ability. And there were times when, for instance, I wanted to, let's say, get a new car. I remember one in particular, and I had been driving this Oldsmobile for quite some time. And
was it bought new?
You know, well, I suppose so. I really don't know.
Okay. What model year was that? What?
Well, let me see if I can put that together. I graduated in '35 from Cranbrook, and my family was so happy to see me eventually graduate that they gave me a two-door Oldsmobile, a new car, 35. And Chuck Luce and Jack Maynard and I took a trip east, and we had a lot of fun with that car, but we were responsible for its maintenance and operating costs and all that. And about 2 years later, I'm sure it was time to turn the car in because everybody did it at that time. Well, I knew a fellow by the name of Hanson, I can't think of his first name, who had the Studebaker agency. And he made me a better deal than the Oldsmobile agent.
Who was the Olds agent, do you remember?
Well, it was right there on South Capitol Avenue.
Trevelyan?
Probably. Was there a Hanson? No, Hanson was Studebaker.
That there was a Trevelyan
Yeah,
Olds.
but I think it was before my dad got involved in the agency. And Van Kuren and some of those guys.
He was involved in what agency?
Well, what later became Lansing Oldsmobile.
Oh,
I think they bought out Trevelyan.
oh.
And so I needed $600 to make the trade for that new Studebaker.
1937 model?
Yeah, it was a President, four-door, straight eight. Man, that was really some car. One of the best ones, incidentally, that I ever had. And so at that time, why, we had to go down and talk to Mr. Olds about those things, and he was in Florida. So I wrote him a letter, told him what I wanted, and I got a telegram back that said something to the effect that if I thought I could afford to throw away $600 for, how did he put it? Another kind of a car other than Oldsmobile, then go ahead. But that's $600 you won't see again. Well, I went ahead and had the Oldsmobile, the Studebaker, and I think I drove it about 2 years, very happy with the whole thing. Wonderful road car. Red four-door, my, that was the stuff, I'll tell you. But then one thing led to another, and you get back into Oldsmobiles. And then when the war came along, of course, I didn't take a car to Houston, but rather I bought one down there because I knew I'd be there for a long time, so I got essentially what I wanted, which was a black convertible.
The Olds?
An Olds,
Don't
yeah.
you wish you had it now?
Well, only as a curiosity piece.
Yes.
I had 3 tops on that. The climate down there is such that your canvas top just wouldn't hold up. So I had 3 tops on that car before I finally sold it, and then flew an airplane back home. Yeah, that was a nice car.
Well, we're in business again, Olds.
All right.
We're talking about Mr. Olds always had kind of a warm feeling toward the product that bore his name, even though he was not
Yeah.
associated with Rio.
He, well, he had a characteristic that I think some of us inherited. I did, I know. And that is when he would finish a job, when he'd get something up and running and it met his requirements for continued use or operation, whatever it was, and he'd sell it or walk away from it. And that was the end of it. There was nothing, no looking back at all. And that's what he did with Rio. although they did go through that proxy fight in the 30s, early 30s. But after he won that and they got straightened out, he walked away from it, and that was, I never heard another word about it. And with Oldsmobile, it was an ongoing thing, although of course he had no financial interest. And he just felt that it was proper to drive an Oldsmobile around Lansing. But in Charlevoix and in Florida, he drove Chrysler products. He liked them much better. And so we all just went down there. That when we went to Florida, we knew we were going to have DeSotos and Dodges and stuff like that. But he did use Oldses here, and almost exclusively. He did have a Pierce Arrow, but he didn't very often go to the richer side of things. The Pierce Arrow, I think, that was in the 30s, and that's because they were doing a lot of traveling. Oldsmobile didn't make a car that big. And when they get ready to go to Florida or something like that, or up north, they always took the Pierce Arrow because it could hold a lot of baggage and a lot of people. So that's the way they went.
What about the little reel? That little reel that's a replica of the larger Flying Cloud, was it?
Yeah, no, that was the little touring car.
The little touring car.
And that, you know, well, when Lansing had a centennial or whatever it was, and I was at the Olds Hotel, we borrowed that car from the Rio factory and put it in the window at the coffee shop of the hotel as a display. And then the man from Alabama, was it someplace down south, when that man bought the Rio factory, he got that car with it, and he also got the one of the last of the Rio Royals.
1937?
I think so. And he took them south, and I don't know where they are now. He took them to his home in Mississippi or Alabama or wherever it was. But I understand the Rio Royal has been sold, and it's back up in Detroit, owned by an automotive engineer that collected the beautiful cars. I've met him 2 or 3 times, but I don't recall his name.
Well, this little Rio, what was the power in that?
Well, that had a little, I think it was a little, a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine, horizontal, and it was just big enough to drive it. There were 5 of them made, but only one of them had an engine in it.
Oh.
And they were made for display purposes, sales gimmicks. And the one that had the engine in it was sold to Barnum Bailey Circus. So they drove it around for years and years in the circus. Then they lost sight of it, as I remember the story, and all of a sudden it turned up in a barn in Pennsylvania. That a Rio dealer happened to be out making a call on some farmer, and they went into the garage to look at whatever he was turning in, and there was that little old Rio, covered with dirt, dust, straw, you name it. And so he called the factory right away, and they bought it from this guy, and it cost him $3,500 to reupholster it, clean it up, and put it back into running condition.
What was that, in the early 30s then?
No, I'd say the late 30s.
Late 30s.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's the one that was sold to this fellow in the South with the Rio. Well, wonder where these 4 replicas were that didn't have units.
Well, you know, like anything that you make for advertising, anything can happen to them. They may or may not be around someplace. There's no record among the Rio papers that I know of that says where they went. They may have gone to California. I suppose they were spread out throughout the country, with the idea being that they would be on loan and used for display purposes. But I really don't know.
Oles, are they doing anything at MSU with the Rio collection out there?
Not that I know of. No, they're all in the archives. Everything is cataloged.
They've cataloged.
As I understand it, yeah.
Okay. I didn't
And
realize that.
this was you're talking about the material that Niemeyer used when he wrote that book?
Well, all of the material that came out of the Rio Motor Car Company.
Yeah. Supposed to be all out there, and I think it's all been cataloged, but I don't know.
See, I didn't know it had been cataloged. I see.
Well, it may not have been, Helen. It may be just out there. I refer people out there because I frequently get calls about the Rio or about some people, some person, something like that, and I just tell them to call the archives of the Michigan State University Library, and that's the last I hear of it.
Well, speaking of people, when you said you get calls in reference to people, do you remember Reuben Shetler? Remember a name like that, connection with Mr. Oles?
No.
Okay.
No, the name is very similar, if not the same, to the guy that runs that very fine grocery store out there at Trowbridge intersection. But maybe I'm mispronouncing his name.
Oh, Goodrich's?
No, it's Goodrich's store, yeah.
Oh, I see.
But it just seems to me as though Shepler or Shetler, something like that, was the owner, yeah.
What about, when we were looking at those home movies, you mentioned Wallace, that was Mr. Oles' brother.
Mm-hmm.
And was there a Schuyler Oles too? Schuyler?
Well, that name is familiar. They had one brother that went west, and I think they sort of lost track of him, except every now and then he would surface. And the last time I heard about the brother was a letter from somebody else in Fort Worth at a nursing home, that there was an old man there. I've got it down in the office, but I can't put names to it right now, that claimed he was Ari Oles' brother. And it didn't ring a bell with any of us up here. But we've tried to keep all those inquiries and things like that. But I do know now one of the brothers was the general sales manager for the St. Louis, Missouri area. But I don't know whether it was Wallace or not.
For the dealership, you mean,
Yeah.
selling Rios?
Either Rios or Oldsmobiles, yeah.
I see.
Yeah. But
How many brothers were there of Mr. Oles?
well, I think there were 4, and then Aunt Sade, Sarah.
There'd be Ari Oles, Aunt Sade, Wallace, then
And I think there were 2 others.
2 others. One may have been Schuyler, and then another.
Yeah, but I would have to look it up. As I said, I don't remember all these funny little things that happen to families.
Mm-hmm.
My mind travels in different directions, I guess.
Well, of course, there's a number of generations between two, and Mr. Rolls passed away in 1950.
That's right. Now, you might want to check with Sue Darnton, you know. She would know about Wallace, and maybe about a lot of the others.
Now, how would that connection come in?
Well, she was my second cousin, you see. Her grandfather was my grandfather's brother.
So, Sue Darnton's father was, what was?
Sue Darnton's father was, oh gee, and I can... Walters. Walters. She was a Walters.
Okay.
And her mother, though, was Wallace's daughter.
Let's see here now. Wallace was the brother of R.E.
Mm-hmm.
And
I don't recall. Eddis Walters.
Eldest Walters
Mhm.
was Sue Darton's mother.
Mother.
And now let me see, how do we get Walters in there?
Well, because Walters was Sue's father, but I don't know where he came from.
Okay,
And I don't remember his first name.
okay. Let me see if I got this right. Now, Wallace was the brother of R.E. Olds.
Mm-hmm.
And Wallace had a daughter, Eddis, who married
Yeah.
a Walters.
That's right.
And Eddis,
Phil Walters.
Bill Walters. And Sue Darton is...
Was their daughter.
The other day, when we were looking at the home movies, seems to me there was a Pruden name that there's a family connection there too.
Well, not with our family.
Not with yours.
I was trying to identify the little blonde-headed boy that ran around on the beach, and that was Keith Pattengill.
Keith Pattengill.
And then his mother appeared, and I was at a loss for her name because she looked so much like my Aunt Frances, but she was not. It later came to me. That was Edwina Pattengill. And Edwina was a Pruden.
Oh.
So that's where that came in.
Okay. Now, your Aunt Frances, how was she an aunt to you?
Well, my father's sister.
Oh, yeah, that was the one daughter.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Mhm.
Okay. Very fine.
Mm-hmm. It gets kind of scrambled.
So really, there are two brothers of Mr. Olds that one really doesn't know about.
Well, that I didn't know about. I know they're in these books,
Okay.
but beyond that, I can't tell you much about them.
But now Olds, Woody Rowe is married
Mm-hmm.
to
Charlotte
Charlotte
Carr,
Carr.
Dr. Carr's daughter.
Okay, and they had what children?
They had Linda, and a son, J. Woody Jr.,
Okay.
who just got married.
Oh, okay. Then I'll follow that up with Woody.
Yeah.
Okay, now you are married to
Doris
Doris
Berkey.
Berkey. And you have your children.
Well, I have, this is a long story. If you start with me, that my first wife was Barbara Hughes,
Okay.
who is now Barbara Hughes. At that time, Barbara Pyatt Products here in Lansing.
Pyatt Products. What did they do?
And they made water heaters and oil furnace equipment and stuff like that. But let's see, that was Barbara, and then she married Harvey Hughes.
Now, you were married in 37?
37.
Okay.
And then that marriage didn't work out, so we were divorced. I went to Texas, and in 43, I married Faye Powers, a Texas girl, Houston girl.
Okay.
We had, Barbara and I had no children, but with Faye, we had 2 children,
Okay.
Metta Jane Anderson, and
Metta Jean using your grandmother's.
yeah, both. Well, Metta, my grandmother, and Jane using Faye's mother's name, her
Okay.
grandmother, I guess,
Metta Jean.
and Rio Ariels Anderson Jr.,
Oh,
and he goes by the name of Rio.
okay.
Um,
Now, they were born right about around the close of the war.
yeah. hmm
Okay.
And Metta has no children. She's not married. Rio had 2 children, a Ben and Heather, by his first wife, who died. You know, I'm getting overloaded here.
Well, that's.
Anyway, then he remarried Sally, to whom he's married now. And Sally came equipped with 3 children.
Oh,
So they had a grandchild. So Rio is 1 generation ahead of me. But in any event, they now have 5. I don't think there was any official adoption amongst them. No, that takes care of that group. So Faye, that takes care of Faye's end of it, chapter. Then we were divorced in 48, I think, or 9, 48, 49. And Doris and I were married in 50. And she had 1 daughter, Diane, whom I have adopted. And between Doris and myself, we had 2 other daughters, Deborah and Katrina.
now Doris was who before she?
Well, Doris was Davis, but her maiden name was Berkey.
Okay.
Then during the war, she married Dick Davis, and then that didn't work out, but in the meantime, they had Diane. So Doris had 1 child when I met her.
Okay.
And that's essentially where we are right now, I think.
So, and with the adoption of Doris's daughter, you have 3 daughters.
3. Mm-hmm.
I see.
Mhm.
Are they locally here now?
No, Diane is, but Debbie lives in Dublin, Ohio, outside of Cleveland, of Columbus. And Katrina lives in Newton, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. And we just live here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that's the lineage to date.
I see. Okay.
Now Diane has 1 daughter, Emily, and Debbie has 2 sons, Matthew and Gregory. But that's the end of the whole thing as of today. Who knows what next year will bring?
Life moves right along.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to get into your personal life, but I wanted to kind of get people straightened in my mind.
Yeah, well, it's difficult, Helen, because see, I've been married 3 times. And the first one, no children. The second one, 2 children. And the third one, 2 children. But my third wife has 1 child, whom I've adopted, so we have 3. And without getting mixed up in the names again, it's really, that's about it.
Okay. Tends to more girls than boys, doesn't it?
Well, I guess. Yeah, although my own grandchildren, 2 boys, as opposed to 1 girl.
Oh, yes.
So,
Now, when Meta and Mr. Olds had just the 2 daughters, did they have any other children?
they had 1 other who was stillborn, or, well, I think stillborn. And I think they had one that lived just a few days. I had a daughter, I'm sorry, I had a sister after Peggy, my present sister, who only lived a few days.
Oh,
So there were 3 of us.
I see.
But those are the ones that didn't make it, that's all.
Well, sometimes little people in those days didn't. They didn't
Yeah,
know as much about keeping the little ones alive as they do now.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's true. Why didn't the management of the Rio work out in the 1930s? What went wrong there?
Well, the story that I always hear, and why did they have the proxy fight? The story I have always heard was that Richard Scott, who was the president at the time, and a very able man, he did a good job running the company, but he let his personal beliefs interfere. And you remember about that time why they repealed prohibition. And as soon as it was repealed, the orders came in just like an avalanche for beer trucks. But he was a teetotaler. He was against it. He didn't like liquor in any form, shape, or manner, and he refused to make them. And if he knew they were going for that purpose, they wouldn't make them. They wouldn't fill the order. Now, I have never seen that in writing. I really don't know how true it is, or even if it's just partially true. But that's the story that I've always heard. So the board of directors decided they needed a new man, but Scott by that time had enough stock and influence that they ended up in a proxy fight, which he lost. And Mr. Olds won and went back in there and tried to turn the company around. And I guess he did until World War, well, no, they were making trucks in World War II, sure.
Well, when did Mr. Olds put Mr. Scott in the Rio? I mean, now you said Mr. Scott was the chief operating officer?
CEO. Well, I would have to say in the 20s somewhere, because Grandpa became involved in Hill Diesel and in many other things, and the Florida real estate boom and bust, the hotel business in one way.
The reason for getting a local manager was to relieve him so he could
Yeah.
meet other interests.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now you mentioned the Florida boom and bust. Do you know, can you tell us something about Oldsmobile?
Well, not a great deal, except that it is still there. It was just about 50 years ahead of its time because Grandpa has a history of getting into things too soon, and that was one of them. and they had a post office and a bank and, you know, all the things that a little village would have as it wanted to start to grow, plus lots and lots and lots of land. Unfortunately, the land was practically at sea level, and it was at the north end of the Tampa Bay, so when they got real good high water, the land had a tendency to disappear. And he didn't know it at the time, but that's essentially what happened. So about that time, why the real estate market fell in Florida anyway. So it was just another casualty. But the idea was that he would be developing that as we now think of retirement homes. Except that was so early that it was only a concept, and he never had the opportunity to do anything with it.
He was really ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he started Olds Hall over in Daytona Beach for retired missionaries and ministers. And the concept there was that they had to be able to pay a little bit towards their own keep. They had to be ambulatory. It wasn't going to be an infirmary or anything like that. But to those who had retired from the church or the field or whatever it happened to be, a church, not the church, but a church.
Any denomination?
Any denomination. They could come in there. It was small. I've forgotten exactly how many people they could accommodate. It was less than 100 when he started, certainly. And he bought an old defunct hotel and built it up and restored it. I served on the board down there. As a matter of fact, I was the chairman when we made the recommendation to merge Olds Hall with the Lutheran retirement system, because, frankly, the government was too much competition, the United States government. And they would put up these beautiful buildings down there and let people move in practically scot-free, and they had no responsibility, just a matter of moving in. Well, we couldn't compete. So we decided to turn it over to the Lutheran people, and they have carried on that philosophy and done a good job.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. But there again, you see, now that was before the war. That started in 1940, I guess, somewhere back there. No, he was so far ahead of his time there. And there was just, he had a unique ability to read the handwriting on the wall. When something wasn't going to work, he could see it. And then he either got out or fixed it.
Do you think that he minded, I'm going to digress here a minute, leaving the Olds Motor Works and beginning a new company, Rio?
I think it all, from what I can read, I never heard him talk about that, but from what I can read, I think it was just an orderly transition. I think that he left Olds because they voted him out, frankly, and there's no doubt but what he would be hurt emotionally on the thing. But almost in the next breath, people from Lansing with financing came along and said, let's build another car. What do you think it ought to be? So that I really haven't checked the dates, but I have a sneaking idea that they were less than a year apart.
You're right.
And it was just a transition that he had the momentum built up, and Lansing took advantage of it, and boy, it took off.
Were you ever in his garages or shops when he was experimenting on something?
Only one, down at Hills Diesel. And that's when he was experimenting with a 3-cylinder generator with a unique design that instead of valves, it used ports. And That was for the Navy in World War II. It did run. Whether they ever put it in production, I don't know.
What were they going to use it for?
Yeah, electrical generator. And it was something quite new. It had a tiered cylinder, a piston. And it was worked out in such a way that when it came down, some of the ports closed and others opened. And then on the way up, the reverse happened. And I saw it running down there.
So you believe he had that?
I think he patented it, but I really don't know. In those days, that was just, from my standpoint, it was something that he was interested in. He asked me down to take a look at it, so we went. But it didn't mean that much to me. I was not that much oriented to the mechanical world, shall we say. Now, if it had been something that had to do with an airplane, that'd been different, because I was ready for that. But it was wartime, you know, and we had a lot of other things to think about.
Was he interested in flying?
He was interested in it, but not to the point where he would do it very often. But he was very, very remarkable. He came over to Houston one day, and I mean that quite literally. I met him at the station. In those days, most of us took the train. He came over from Daytona Beach. It was January, February. I met him at the station at 7:30 in the morning, and Mother was visiting me at the time. He wanted to, of course, we had breakfast. Then he wanted to see what this town was like, and I spent the morning driving him around out to the ship channel, the basin, and shipping basin, the oil refineries, plus some of the other things downtown, the big buildings. We had lunch, and then in the afternoon we went out to the airport, and he saw the planes that I was flying. And interestingly enough, he stood right there and looked at him, and he said, you know, if you would close up these wheel wells, you'd streamline the airplane a little bit more. Eventually, that happened. And he had some other suggestions that were obvious to him, but of course not to us. And they all appeared on later models. But then in the afternoon, we went back to the hotel where Mother was staying and visited for a while, and I put him on the train that night back to Daytona Beach. He had seen Houston. He knew more about it than I did. I lived there. But that was typical. Absolutely typical of him. Whether he got the information from reading ahead of time or later or just by osmosis, I don't know. But he had seen the city. That's all he needed. To the best of my knowledge, he never came back.
But he had property in the South too, didn't he?
Well, not in Texas.
I see.
And at that time, I don't think he had any in Louisiana or any place over there. Did in Florida, of course, but...
Now, other than Oldsmobile, he had other properties?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What kind of property?
Well, I'm told that he had an orange grove at one time, and various speculative things. I call them speculative because I'm looking at it in the past tense. But at the time he had it, he probably thought they were going to take off and go.
Well, what about Chicago? We've heard that he had real estate buildings in Chicago.
Well, I don't know about Chicago. I know he had some in Kansas City, and I think St. Louis, because Woody went down there. But this is a good place, and of course in Detroit. But this is a good place to ask Woody, because he was in the office. He knew about those things.
Okay, I'm going to make a little note here. Okay. You'd mentioned when we were looking at those Olds family films that Mr. Olds on that one tour was, I think, to France, that had to leave the tour and return home.
That's right.
Do you remember why he had to do that?
Well, they were running into problems with the what's now the Michigan National Tower. And
they were building that structure then?
they started to build it, and so he wanted to get home to straighten them out and see just what was going on.
Now, it was prior to 1929, or close to there.
That's right.
28 perhaps.
Yeah. And so he took the boat back, and you always figured time in those days, you know, you had to have a lot of it. So he took the boat back, and then we came back probably 3 weeks later.
When did he buy that property where the bank is?
I don't really know. It started out to be a theater, because I can remember the cement floor was already down, and we used it as a parking lot, because you could drive in from Allegan, and you get down just the way you would in a theater like that, and then go into parking slots on either side painted on the floor. So the floor of the theater was there. The ramp type effect was already there. So they had to get that out of there before they could build the building.
Oh.
But yeah, I remember that. It was going to be a theater, and then it never materialized. But I've heard a lot of different stories about how the land was acquired, but I really don't know. And lots of times, you know, post-mortem on things like that, I frequently felt as though I was putting out brush fires, but I never knew what started them. So.
Okay. Well, now he was also involved as the operating officer at Rio at that time, or was Scott in then?
No, I'm pretty sure Scott was there.
So it would have been the early 20s maybe that Scott went in?
Originally, probably so.
Okay. Then after Mr. Scott was out in this proxy fight and Mr. Olds took over the Rio, how long was Mr. Olds in Rio before it was sold?
Well, I don't think he waited until it was sold. I think he got in there and turned it around.
I see.
And or started turning it around, and then got out when they got what he thought was good management.
So he had really left before they ceased building cars in the South?
Yeah, as far as I know he did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, in the later years, was he still planning the vacations and the get-togethers where all the try to keep the family together? And
yeah, he was. He took my mother and father. When I say he took them, I think he organized the trip, but I don't know who paid for it. My mother and father and Bun and Blondie Rowe to Mexico, and sometimes to the southwestern part of the United States, but Arizona and New Mexico, you know, were not that popular in those days, and it was kind of primitive country out there. After all, they'd only been admitted to the Union since 1912, and the trains went through in Santa Fe. We used to go out on that, but still, it was kind of sketchy. So it was more of an adventure, I guess, to go to New Orleans and then take the boat across to Veracruz, or however they went to Mexico. But I know in 25, he and my grandmother went around the world with a bunch of their friends, but they were contemporaries. He didn't take the family. But when it was time to go to Florida, I know we all went to Florida.
Now, what time of year was that, May? Or no?
No, that
January?
would be in January, yeah.
Pardon me.
Because I know it was interesting, Helen, when we get ready to go, I remember he would rent a whole Pullman car. But he got the entire family, including the Abels and the Wallaces and those people on board. You know, those Pullman cars were pretty big in those days.
No, those were family friends.
Yeah. Well, no, they were part of the family itself.
Oh, I see.
So collectively, he'd get the whole family on board, and off we'd go.
How were you related to the Abels?
I don't. Oh, well, through my grandmother, and I can't tell you
Grandmother,
that.
would that be Anderson or?
No, Olds. Yeah.
And the Wallaces the same?
Same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My grandparents Anderson didn't figure into much of our traveling here in the East.
Okay.
When we went west, that was a whole different ball game. But in the East, why, it was really an Eastern contingent.
Did you have extra help from your folks?
At home?
Like, I mean, maids or to look after the children or cooks or?
We had a cook that was with us for years and years by the name of Clara Coates. And she had either a son or a son-in-law by the name of Offenauer, who had a very fine radio shop here in town. I guess they're still here, I really don't know. But Clara was just a gem, and she was there year in and year out, day in, day out. Fantastic cook, and it didn't make any difference whether it was for one person or 20. She'd come up with excellent food. But they also had, Mother and Dad also had a maid that did the housework and helped wherever, she could. In the very early days, Mother planned all the meals, because we still have those menus, and looked up recipes and did the paperwork. But she also did the shopping. And of course, we could, in those days, they had 2 telephone lines here in town. And there was the Central, and then there was the Bell. And it depended on which grocery store you wanted to talk to.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
But they had home delivery.
Way out there?
Well, no, this is when we lived down on Townsend Street. No, when we lived out on the farm in the big house, she had a driver, chauffeur, but still a cook, and and a maid. And then at the gatehouse, she had Joe Garippo, who's still alive. I guess he's in his 90s now, as the gardener. And he came by way of friends from Buffalo, Maury Thorne. And in Buffalo, Joe worked for Pierce Arrow. So he had an automotive background, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. When did your folks move into the, out on the large home?
About 32.
About 32.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then by that time, your grandparents were living on the corner of Main and Washington.
Well, they had always lived there.
As far as you can remember, that's your first recollection?
Yeah, that house was built, and they moved into it in well, it was started in 1902, and they moved in 1904.
Okay.
So they always lived there. And we lived at the corner of St. Joe and Townsend in that, well, it's now a vacant lot.
Did you tell me earlier that that's where the McLaughlin Hospital
Yeah.
used to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
619 Townsend.
619 Townsend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that wasn't too far from your grandparents.
No, it was roughly 2 blocks. And then the Rose lived another block down St. Joe at 404 West St.
Well,
Joe.
that would be 1 block farther west.
Yeah, and that is now where the State Chamber office building is.
Oh, on the corner there, Walnut and...
Yeah.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Later was a nursing home.
Well, ours was.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Rose was too. The Row home, yes, I remember that now. Yeah. But there again, why, that's, would be up to Woody's.
Yes, I can see
Yeah.
there's quite a number of questions that are forming in my mind that I can talk with Woody about. And what does he like to be called? I mean, I've met him once.
Oh, I'd call him Woody.
You think that
Everybody
would be the
does.
way to do it?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because he has the one initial, J, for John, but he only uses that when he's signing his name. And then J. Woodward Rowe, but he goes by Woody, and everybody knows. I think that'd be the best way to
All
go.
right, thank you. Oles, what are your personal feelings about your grandfather as a man and as an inventor, about Mr. Oles? Is there some way you'd like to sum him up in your own personal feeling as his grandson?
Well, I would just say he was a very warm individual. He had an awful lot of get up and get, as they used to say. He was a traveling salesman, let's face it. He was out on the road peddling automobiles when they were practically handmade. So he knew what it was like to be out there and rough and tumble of the competitive world. But he also liked to stay somewhat in the background because he was not one for pushing himself, pushing his product, but not himself. And he was religious, but again, we didn't touch upon that particularly, but he had his own code of ethics, which I don't think anybody could fault. He did not smoke, he did not drink until the very last year in his life, and then it was only on doctor's recommendation. But at the same time, he had owned in his lifetime a couple of bars that must have been profitable, or he wouldn't have owned them. I don't think he went out to buy them. I think he accidentally ended up with them.
They weren't local?
No, not local. And excellent businessman. He had an intuitive sense that invariably was good. He wonderful visualizing a given situation, not only a situation among people, but mechanical. And well, Helen, you've seen that that exhibit down at the museum of the bronze forward and reverse gears down there that Bob Huxtable, I think, brought down. Well, prior to that time, nobody had ever thought of that. They knew they wanted to get the car to go backwards, but they didn't know how to do it. But he would visualize that until finally, by golly, he and a couple other engineers, probably I'd call them engineers, mechanics, visualized that and built one, and as a result, why, we can now back up when we want to. But prior to that time, it didn't exist. So there were a lot of things, you see, that he could visualize and actually create that just weren't there before. That's about all I can tell you on him. But he was warm, he was generous, but you did things the right way or you didn't do them at all.
Did he keep in touch with Frank Clark, the carriage builder?
I really don't know. I know him by name, of course, but I really don't know. Those things all happened, you know, before my time.
Yes.
Even though they might have lived and been alive, I don't ever remember meeting them.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add to this interview, Oles?
No, it's been interesting. I haven't gone down these paths in my memory for years and years and years.
I hope it's been fun to do that.
Yeah, it has been fun. There's no question about it. I'm just amazed at the names that I could remember, because I haven't thought of those people in a long time.
You've done a good job.
Yeah.
You have. I really appreciate your signing the interview agreement, too, because this is a historic document that we're making, and it's very meaningful to us. It'll be a wonderful addition to the Oldsmobile History Center.
Well, you see, my memories go off in a different direction than probably Woody's will, because Woody was closer to the family all the way through, especially in the office. And mine go off in different ways. Woody went away to school, as did I, and he went overseas in World War II. I just went to Texas, but we are two different people, and he emphasized one side, and I just happened to go along with the other side. So you'll get a whole different ball game from him.
Well, I appreciate your suggestion that he will be willing, and I will...
Well, I think so.
Should I call him direct? Can I do that? Would that be all right? Or do you want to talk with him first?
Why don't I contact him first and tell him what it's all about, and that you would appreciate interviewing him much the same way we did here.
Yes, and he can come here, or we can go down there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seemed to work out better for you to come here because we had your films here.
Yeah.
And you were able to provide the identification.
Mm-hmm.
But, where we do it is no problem. It's just nice if it's quiet and no interruptions, that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, let me approach him first, then I'll call you, and you can then set up a time and all that.
I'd appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think maybe we covered all of our territory here, and...
Well, if you think of something else, give me a call.
Thank you.
Time staggers on, you know, and little things float to the surface that you don't always see.
That's true. Sometimes later things come. And if you think of something, please call me. Because we can certainly work together to preserve history that should have been recorded a long time ago.
Yeah.
I'm going to shut our tape off here.